Well, it's great to see so many people late on a Thursday afternoon. Of course, I want to thank many as well who've helped to bring me here, Jessica, Joel Wolf, and the Feinberg Planning Committee, which made all of this possible, and of course the Feinberg family itself. When I learned about this series, I thought, every state university in the United States needs an intelligent and generous donor to support a public forum like this one. This is really just a terrific forum, and I'm so proud to be part of it. For me, it's also always a very special pleasure to come back to the Connecticut Valley. I did my undergraduate studies here at Mount Holyoke a very, very long time ago. I think it's also really, it pleases me to know that so many of you in the audience are students at the local 5 colleges, perhaps. And I also want to acknowledge as loudly as I can the teachers who are participating in this program. Teachers do such critical work. They prepare each generation of children to deal with the incredibly complex issues of the 21st century. And immigration is by no means the least complex of the bunch. So, my title is Nations, that's plural, of Immigrants, the U.S. in Global Perspective. And given the introduction, I would like to say this is more on the grand narrative synthetic side of my work. It's also a work in progress. So I'm particularly eager to hear your reactions and your questions towards the end of my talk. Just wave if this thing gets out of sync, okay? Okay, so during the many years that I taught in the US, I often ask my students in beginning world history courses, and I do teach world history, not US history, I ask them a kind of a trick question. And here's the question. Some of you may know the answer. In the year 2005, what country in the world had the highest proportion of foreigners living on its national territories? Now, it's probably no surprise to any of you that the largest number of my American students believe that the United States is the correct answer. And when I ask them to explain their choice, the least articulate students actually give the most revealing responses, because what they typically say is something like, well, you know, everybody knows the United States is a nation of immigrants. Such students are then often pretty surprised to learn that they're wrong. The correct answer to the question is not the United States of America, but the United Arab Emirates, where more than 2/3 of the population in 2005 were foreigners. Imagine a society where every 2 out of 3, 3 out of 4 people are what we would call immigrants. But they and I, in this question, called foreigners. Some students are also even more surprised to learn that countries like Israel and Canada and Switzerland and Australia are all home to higher proportions of foreigners than the United States. Now, to be honest, of course, the United States is a very big country, and so 14.2% of its very large population is a lot of foreigners. The U.S. remains the largest recipient of foreigners. But as we measure demographic impact, many smaller societies are much more heavily impacted by migration than the United States. So I know it's kind of a trick question, and it may seem a trifle unfair to begin a class with such kind of duplicitous trickiness, but I've done this over the years, and so I'm going to stand by my decision, because I think this question and the kinds of answers that it provokes from beginning students of history provide the students with a good introduction to what I'm going to do in in the class, but also a good introduction to what I hope to do with you here this afternoon. First of all, my question reminds us that the U.S. is not alone in admitting foreigners to live and to work on its territories. But how often do our public debates about immigration ever reference what's going on in other countries? This is not a frame of reference for most Americans. Second, my question also helps students to begin to recognize how the categories that we use to label and describe and analyze people can become so familiar to us that they seem natural and universal and useful in analyzing any part of the world. Remember, I asked them a question about foreigners, and they gave me an answer about immigrants. And quite frankly, those are overlapping, but not completely the same thing. And some of my students do know that. They do know that foreigners are not quite the same as immigrants because they often are waving up their hand at me and saying, oh, come on, no one thinks that the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, is a nation of immigrants. And they're right. In fact, no one in the in the UAE or outside of the UAE considers it to be a nation of immigrants. And the foreigners who live and who form the majority of the population of the United Arab Emirates are all people who are working on temporary labor contracts that, at least in theory, require them to leave the country eventually. They're not immigrants because usually, at least we think of immigrants as coming to stay, even though so much of my own work has shown they don't always, and nor have they ever. If those foreigners living in the United Arab Emirates have children, furthermore, those children will remain foreigners. So there are almost no immigrants in the UAE. There really are only foreigners, including, for example, Somali refugees, who often manage to live in the UAE and Dubai and many of the other Emirate countries for many years, but always on a series of temporary work or residence permits that require them to pay bribes and get motivated and mobilized, often even to find a sponsor every 2 years. That's a very different experience as a human experience from getting a green card and settling in for however long you want in the United States. Now, of the countries that appear on this list here behind me, and they appear there because they have some of the highest proportions of foreigners in the world, Canada and Australia are, of course, arguably much more like the United States in their histories of immigration. And those two countries do, at least occasionally call themselves nations of immigrants. But Canada, as I'm now reminded every day, since I just moved there, celebrates itself not as a nation of immigrants, but usually it celebrates its multiculturalism. And it does so in ways that include immigrants, but don't single out the immigrants as the only significant group who made Canada multicultural. Native-born French-speaking Canadians help to make Canada multicultural, as do the Indigenous peoples of Canada, called First Nations north of the border. They are as much a part of the multiculturalism that Canada celebrates as are Canada's millions and millions and millions of immigrants. It was 18.9% in 2005. It's risen several percentage points since there, and I just want to plug my new hometown. Toronto is now majority foreign-born, majority immigrant, 51% of the population. And that indeed was one of my motives for moving to Canada, so I could, towards the end of my long career, teach immigrant students again. So for me, these very preliminary comparisons of the United States to other countries with significant migrant populations raises an obvious, and I actually think also an important question. Why actually is the United States almost alone in pronouncing itself and celebrating itself as a nation of immigrants? And that's the question that I want you to think about as you listen to my own still preliminary explanations, as you listen to me think through what a plausible answer to that question might be. Why? Why does the United States celebrate itself as a nation of immigrants? None of the other countries on that list do. What's going on here? Now, that question about the U.S. could be answered, it could be answered with a completely U.S.-centered story. We could focus exclusively on the U.S. and try to answer it. And I will highlight some features of that domestic story of how the United States became and began to imagine itself as a nation of immigrants. But my main purpose here today is actually to develop an answer to the question that places the United States and its immigrants in a more global and especially a more comparative context. To understand the United States as a nation of immigrants, I'm going to assert here at the beginning, it is useful to appreciate that people in other places and in other times might have, but did not make the same choices when they imagined their own nations. Canada, for example, as multicultural. Indeed, right down to the present, Switzerland, which also appeared on that list, Switzerland, a multilingual country, multicultural country that I'm going to compare a bit more systematically to the United States in a few minutes. Switzerland adamantly proclaims that it is not, it never has been, and it never will be a nation of immigrants. Thank you, just the same. It's not about the numbers. 23%, who cares? We, the Swiss say, are not a nation of immigrants. They've got the numbers. They could imagine themselves as a nation of immigrants, but they don't. So I want to look at the choices of the U.S. in imagining itself in this way, both from the side of how it's actually done in the U.S. and how it's done differently, really, in countries that have lots of foreigners and lots of migrants, but aren't nations of immigrants. Okay, so how do you do this? I've been thinking about this for a while. Can't say I have the only answer, but I do have one answer, at least. So, to explain the historical choices made in the United States and in other countries with significant migrations, I'm going to offer comparisons to the United States along basically three axes. This is how I'm going to do my comparison. First, in comparing the U.S. to countries that made other choices and came up with other imagined nations, it's important to understand, I've got to get that out of the way. It's important to understand the importance of demography and the ubiquity, really, of human mobility, not just as an element in U.S. or American history, but in world history. Second axis, it's important to understand how modern nation states, through law and through policy, all, in one way or another, distinguish between insiders and outsiders, and to also seek to regulate, or at least document, the mobility of both. Third, and finally, I think it's important to understand how governance by national governments actually requires the creation of categories of people on the move, categories of mobile people. And that's a rather fancy term, but I'm using it to make what I think is a very simple point. And that point is, as my opening anecdote showed, that what mobile people are called and how they are labeled actually matters, and matters in nation building and the imagination of nations. Very different notions of national belonging and very different kinds of nations emerge when those mobile people are labeled as immigrants, as in the US, or as foreigners, as in the United Arab Emirates. Okay, so demography first. In telling a global history of population movements, I've discovered over the years that I usually first have to challenge assumptions that are extremely common among people living in the United States, Canada, and Europe. So let me make this assertion to you. Large and significant migrations are not new. They are not a product of the globalization that happened in the last 30 years. On the contrary, world historians remind us that mobility has been a fact of human life literally for as long as there have been humans on Earth. And what this slide here illustrates is how the first anatomically modern humans, right, their bones look kind of like ours, how anatomically modern humans left Africa and eventually walked and floated around the world, colonizing the entire Earth. On that basis, world historian Patrick Manning says, yes, humans are a mobile species. I'm not so sure I'm willing to go that far, but I do think that world historians are right when they tell us that most modern countries are the product of centuries of human movements and the product of interactions between shifting groups of natives and newcomers. As a provocative new permanent exhibit in a Swiss National Museum proclaims at its entrance, "Keiner ist ewig da." No one has been here forever. And that's a very, as you're going to see, very provocative statement in the Swiss context. In short, it's not the absence of past migrations that explains why so few nations, other than the US, imagine themselves as nations of immigrants. Most countries of Europe, of Africa, of Latin America, South and Southeast Asia, and Australia, as well as all of the American countries, North and South, might have imagined themselves as nations of immigrants based on their migratory pasts, but they didn't do so. World histories of human mobility have also forced historians, I think, to recognize how fundamentally the rise of nation states have, over the past millennium, altered the options, the possibilities, and the constraints that face people who do wish to move about, whether they are moving in search of safety, adventure, work, land, livelihood, education, marriage, opportunity, or fun. There's so many motives that have put people on the road historically. In drawing and patrolling boundaries around their so-called sovereign territories, all nation states have had to find ways to distinguish insiders from outsiders and to create policies that regulate the movements of both. Now here I can turn to political theorists for some help. Political theorists have long distinguished between nations that define themselves and define belonging through blood, and those that define belonging through soil or residence on territory, land. The first, the blood connection, the blood form of belonging, is usually called jus sanguinis, the law of blood, and the latter is called jus solis, the law of the soil. Jus solis is indicated here on this map by the dark blue and lighter blue spots that you see before you. And as the map shows, yes, the United States is dark blue, but it is not alone in granting citizenship and belonging on the basis of residence, soil, or territory. We call this birthright citizenship in the United States, but all of the countries of the Americas, as well as a few other countries around the world, create a sense of belonging through birth on the national territory. The slide also shows, however, that in very large parts of the world, belonging is still much more a matter of blood and the inheritance of nationality from one's parents. That's the pale gray bits up there. All the pieces that you can't see have citizenship and nationality defined by blood. The U.S. is also not quite alone in providing mechanisms for outsiders to change their citizenship or change their nationality and belong. We call that process naturalization, right? There's naturalization law as an important element of immigration law in the United States. And the lighter blue spots that you see in back of you actually point toward countries that allow children born on their soil to change their nationality more easily, more quickly than is the case for their parents, say, who were born outside of the national territory. Beyond those naturalization laws, furthermore, most countries of the world actually provide for some form of naturalization. But it's also nevertheless true, and I'm still piecing together the evidence for this, in most parts of the world, the parts that are gray and invisible up there, the bar for attaining citizenship and belonging through naturalization is very, 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 very high, and relatively few outsiders, foreigners, or immigrants attempt or succeed in vaulting over it. So, again, contrary to popular belief, restrictions on the mobility of outsiders to enter a country were not, at least prior to the 20th century, the most important mechanism for defining who was an outsider and who was an insider. If we look at the modern era, we see expanding, empire-building nations that were so eager for population and for workers that they coerced people into moving, creating the Atlantic slave trade, but also the Ottoman trans-Saharan slave trade, and the Atlantic trade in indentured servants, a group that constituted 80% of all the Europeans who actually came to colonial North America before 1776. This slide is meant to illustrate how many countries there were seeking settlers and workers in industry and plantation agriculture between 1800 and 1920. Those are all the lines that you see on this map here on your left. In Southeast and Northeast Asia, actually, the free and indentured movements of migrants continued up until 1940. In the 19th century, unlike today, most migrants traveled without visas, without passports, without identifying papers of any kind. And that was because their freedom to move was so widely accepted and seen as so beneficial to most nation states that they weren't required. The result of that is, and world historians can now give us convincing evidence, that the migrations of the 19th century in demographic impact were larger than the ones we've been going through for the last 4 to 5 decades. About 3% of the world's population today lives outside the country of its birth. In the 19th century, it was probably more like 4 or 5%. So it's simply not the case that we've become more mobile in our own times. It was, however, during this period of massive 19th century migration, estimated at well over 150 long-distance migrants, that nations around the world began to patrol their borders, began to count either the numbers crossing those borders, or the numbers of outsiders working or living in their territories. And those statistics are themselves evidence, I think, that many countries, had they chosen, could have imagined themselves as nations of immigrants, but actually the way they were counting, as we're going to see, made that impossible. Increasing restrictions on migration, which are illustrated in maybe overly dramatic fashion here in this Eurocentric map on the right. Restriction became a global and worldwide phenomenon in the 20th century, and restrictions were accomplished in very, very different ways across nations. Some countries, like the United States, focused increasingly on controlling the passports, the visas, the identity papers of people at the border. Others let lots of people move in, but wouldn't let them live or work anywhere once they got there. So they issued work permits, or they issued residence permits, and they required the registration of both residents and sometimes also work with the local police. And that's how other countries began to restrict free movement. Over time, and as we move towards our own century, the 20th and 21st century, we can see how effective those restrictions were. Here on the left, up here, we see what happened in Argentina over the course of the 20th century. Argentina in the early 20th century was home to a far higher proportion of immigrants, peaking at close to 30%, than either the United States or Switzerland. Already in 1915, however, Switzerland, that's the green line, from 1900 to 2011, already in 1915, Switzerland had 15% foreign, which is pretty much the same, or a little bit higher than the US. The US is shown here. In every one of those figures, you see the impact of restriction in each of these nations in the 20th century as the proportion of immigrants and foreigners drops to a low, usually in the years around or just after World War II. After 1950, however, percentages of resident foreigners begin to rise in both the US and in Switzerland, with Switzerland surpassing and maintaining a consistently higher demographic impact from foreigners than the United States after 1970. So, as the freedom to move came under critique in the face of these massive 19th century migrations, the categorization of mobile people became a very active and important activity of states around the world, in official statistics, in censuses, and in all kinds of other documents. Governments began to create official categories that distinguish between different types of migrants, and that often enough distinguished the desirable migrants from the undesirable ones. And those categories also played an important role in defining what the relationship of each category of immigrant or foreigners would be to the nation itself. Although the creation and change in official forms of these categorizations, they appear in statistics and government reports all over the world. They're really quite fascinating once you get into them. The official categories were accompanied by even more widespread changes in popular discourse. And I'm going to use a focus on Switzerland and the United States to illustrate how changes in popular discourse figured in the imagination of nations as the world shifted from accepting the freedom of movement towards the international assumption that nation states had to restrict if they were going to survive. So, in the United States, these are the key terms for discussing and categorizing migrants in the 19th century. In the United States, the Treasury Department had been counting the number of passengers, they're at the top of the list, along with trade goods arriving on ships into the ports of the US. They'd begun doing that in 1820. In popular discourse, mobile people on the move were called many things. They were called emigrants, they were called immigrants, they were called foreigners, aliens, refugees, exiles. And I actually, with the help of some undergraduate researchers, undertook an analysis of how often, and in what context each of these different terms were used in the 19th century. And we analyzed massive digitized archives, both of official governmental texts and dozens of digitized local and national newspapers. And two key findings are worth noting here. First, Americans in the 19th century did not imagine themselves as belonging to a nation of immigrants. They didn't, and I'll show you the evidence in a minute. Second, the term immigrant itself substantially changed in meaning before the nation of immigrants could be imagined. And I'm going to show you some of the evidence that led me to those two conclusions. As this slide shows, the phrase nation of immigrants was barely used before the final decades of the 19th century. Right? So 1899, 1911, a few little blips here, and then it takes off. I guess for the videotape, I shouldn't walk away from my podium, should I? Okay. It didn't really become popular in the United States. It didn't take off in public discourse until the 1960s. That one, when I first discovered this, it really fascinated and surprised and threw me. But as I read further, perhaps we shouldn't be surprised to find no imaginings of the U.S. as a nation of immigrants in the 19th century. Because, as the next slide is going to show you, before the opening of Ellis Island in 1892, the most common term that Americans used for people entering the United States was emigrant with an E, not immigrant with an I. And there's one piece of evidence. As this slide, I hope, shows you clearly, foreigners, outsiders, people who traveled long distance and entered the United States at Castle Garden in New York Harbor before 1892. They entered through a door which was marked for emigrants with an E only. And they then passed through a building that was operated by the Commissioner of Emigration of the state of New York. This is so counterintuitive that if I stood in front of this image and talked about emigrants to students, they would say, "Wow, you're talking about immigrants." But at Castle Garden, they were called emigrants. As I soon discovered, and my students discovered, in our work with digitized newspapers, the term emigrant was also used for any American from the East Coast who was moving west. And they were doing so in large numbers across the 19th century. In other words, the foreign-born emigrant, the person we today would call an immigrant, was imagined as leaving Castle Garden and leaving Castle Garden to go west. And that foreigner, that emigrant, was viewed, even prior to naturalization, as the equivalent of an American citizen. Whether native-born or foreign-born, the emigrant was a pioneer, a colonizer, a settler, the people who were going to repopulate a West that an expanding imperial United States wanted to imagine as empty. The term immigrant, by contrast, was reserved mainly for paupers, and for those who were so poor that they settled in eastern cities and sought to work for wages there. Many Irish, all the Chinese, were called immigrants from the 1830s, 40s, and 50s onward. So were the Italians and other industrial workers who entered the United States in the years around 1900. Now, I think it's clear from the way I've presented this that the category of emigrant was a desirable category. The immigrant was undesirable. And on that basis, believe me, you're not going to fantasize about a nation of immigrants. And the occasional uses of the term in the late 19th century repeatedly banged up against the very negative valence of the term immigrant itself. Needless to say, many of the organizations that were founded to argue and to propose political bills for restricting immigration called themselves things like the Immigrant Protection League. Nobody wanted to restrict immigrants, but lots of people in the United States by the end of the 19th century wanted to restrict immigration. Ultimately, as I'm sure most of you know, restrictionists were quite successful in convincing American legislators to limit the entry of those people that we now so casually call immigrants. And think that it's a positive word. It was the language of restriction initially. Note, however, that those who opposed immigration in this period and who sought the restriction of immigration in the United States never challenged birthright citizenship. This is a point to which I will return several times before I finish up. And they never proposed radical changes in the country's requirement for naturalization. They just focused on the border. Armed with birthright citizenship and naturalized citizenship, immigrants and their children and their grandchildren repeatedly across the 20th century challenged the stigma of this term immigrant. Kind of like they embraced it, like the N-word, right? I can make it positive if I use it. If I use this term that other people are calling me, I can make it positive. And most of the people who used the term nation of immigrants did use it after 1920 in a positive way and were the immigrants, the children, and the grandchildren of immigrants. And ultimately, they succeeded in convincing all Americans that the United States should, in fact, celebrate itself as such a nation and end discriminatory limits that privileged migrants of some backgrounds while restricting migrants of others. But note also when they achieved success. They achieved success in altering the meaning of immigration and making it the foundation for a positive celebration of the nation of immigrants only in the 1960s. And in the 1960s, to be frank, Americans were not just debating immigration policy. Any student of American history knows they were also debating the demands of African Americans and Native Americans for equal rights and a firmer sense of belonging in the American nation. And yet neither of those two groups, neither African Americans nor Native Americans, saw themselves as the descendants of immigrants. Thus, for many, and there's very good evidence for this, many African and Native Americans in the 1970s, this picnic of celebration of the nation of immigrants succeeded in including one formerly stigmatized group, the foreigners and the immigrants, only by suggesting, however unintentionally or indirectly, that those with no immigrant roots might not belong yet. So, compare this very brief and necessarily schematic story of the imagination of the United States as a nation of immigrants to what happened on the other side of the Atlantic in Switzerland during the same period of time. I've become fascinated with Switzerland, and maybe not in the way you think. It's not about chocolate, it's not about cuckoo clocks, it's not about even mountains, although I love mountains. It's about how Switzerland imagines itself as a nation with so many foreigners who aren't immigrants among them. Switzerland in the late 19th century was then, as it is now, a multilingual country. It was then, as it is now, a country of several important Protestant religious faiths, and it also had a very significant population of Catholics. It had a small Jewish minority as well. Most of the migrants entering from outside Switzerland in the 19th century were actually from neighboring countries. Like they came from France, they came from Italy, they came from Germany. And so from my American point of view, I always thought, what's the problem they're having with immigrants? Those immigrants speak their language and share their religion. But in Switzerland too, popular categories for mobile people were changing dramatically at this moment of massive migration in the 19th century. And those categories were again establishing a conceptual foundation for a nation that was very different from the United States. Okay, so in Switzerland, as in the United States, there were a lot of different ways of categorizing people on the move. But as ever more massive migrations moved into, through, and out of Switzerland in the 19th century, the categories that you see here before you acquired new meanings, and the distinction between the outsider and the mobile insider became ever sharper. And here, just for reasons of simplicity and linguistic facility, I'm going to focus mainly on the categories used by German-speaking Swiss. I can turn this into a much more complex story by looking at Italian and French-speaking Swiss as well. But let's just do the Germans. They were the largest group then. They're the largest, actually, group now. So for the Swiss, and for many Germans from Germany and Austrians from Austria as well, in this period of time, the end of the 19th century, Einwanderer and Auswanderer, which literally mean immigrant in the first case and emigrant in the second case, were used interchangeably for the Swiss who were leaving. So when a Swiss person headed off to America, as significant numbers did in the 19th century, their neighbors might say, he's an immigrant to America, as he's leaving, right? So there's also this uncertainty in the German Swiss usage between emigrant and immigrant, but this is a term that's only used for the Swiss. It's never used for someone from outside of Swiss borders. By contrast, Zugewanderten, Zuwanderer, Zugezogene, which kind of means pulled toward us, were labels for the Swiss. And there were many of them who were moving from the rural countryside into Swiss cities. This was a word in a way for urbanizer, for urbanization. Or also for those who were moving from one Swiss canton, which is kind of like a Swiss state, to another. And when we think about moving from one canton to another, it's important also to recognize that Swiss citizenship is not then, and it isn't now, exclusively national. Every Swiss person also has a locally based, or sometimes a cantonally based, citizenship in addition to being Swiss. And all of those citizenships across all three levels are based on blood and not on residence. And what that meant, for example, was that when a rural Swiss man or woman moved to the city, he might, and in this case it was the he might have to return home to register his child's birth. Yeah, that was going to be the citizenship of his child. And he also returned home whenever he wanted to vote. Mobile people entering Switzerland from outside were called very different things. They were called foreigners, Ausländer or Fremder. They were called foreign workers, ausländische Arbeiter, most commonly. They were also sometimes called, even by German speakers, two categories, two words that come from the French. They were called saisonnier, which meant a seasonal or a temporary worker, usually in agriculture or in construction, or they were called émigrés. They were foreigners who came to Switzerland to escape persecution at home. Now, by 1915, these Swiss, much like the Americans, were engaged in heated debates over the dangers to the nation that migration was causing. But while Americans complained of too many immigrants, overstuffing the melting pot so that it couldn't work, and that was an image that was very, they like to show bodies kind of stuffed into the melting pot, and no change was occurring because there were just too many people there. While Americans complained about immigrants in the early years of the 20th century, the Swiss feared or what they called Überfremdung. Überfremdung, the foreigner, not the immigrant, was the stigmatized category in Switzerland. And how to reduce the numbers of foreigners, not immigrants, was the focus of Swiss policy, and also a sense of Swiss nationality. While Americans on the other side of the ocean sought to prevent entry, but left birthright citizenship and naturalization unchallenged, the Swiss were mainly concerned to prevent permanent settlement. After 1915, they required work permits. They were usually offered on a short-term basis, about 2 years, and they transformed all foreign workers, essentially, over the course of 50 years, from foreign workers into saisonniers, with limited rights to residence. And since the Swiss, like so many other European nations, defined belonging through blood, those foreign workers who managed to have children in Switzerland created more little foreigners for the Swiss to worry about. And they were also expected to leave eventually. Switzerland had provisions for the naturalization of foreigners, but you couldn't do it if you only had a temporary work permit or if you only had a temporary residence. And even if somehow you managed to get a permanent residency permit and find a stable job, the provisions for naturalization in Switzerland were daunting. They varied from canton to canton and sometimes from village to village. And in many cantons into the 21st century, a foreigner who wished to become Swiss had to submit his application to a referendum of all of the voters of his canton. The Swiss do direct democracy, a point to which I will return. They vote whether you get naturalized. And under those conditions, we know very, very, very few foreigners succeeded in becoming Swiss. Furthermore, largely excluded from birthright citizenship and from naturalized citizenship, even those saisonniers who managed to achieve a more stable work and residency permission couldn't pursue policy changes. They couldn't engage politically in the way that the children and grandchildren of immigrants in the United States could. And as soon as Swiss economy began to recover from World War II, complaints about Überfremdung reappeared immediately. And for most of the 1950s, 60s, and into the 1970s, all of those foreigners were recruited as saisonniers on 2-year contracts with no real opportunity to unify with their families. Now, as I move toward my conclusion, and I want to fast forward to the past few decades, the period of time in world history and in migration that many of us know best. And I want to ask how Switzerland and the United States are responding to the revived migration of the recent past. Those migrations, as we've seen, have raised the proportion of foreigners in both countries. So I was lucky. I got to spend 3 months in Switzerland, in Basel, this past spring. And my goal for that research stay was to try to begin to understand contemporary discussions of Überfremdung and fear of foreigners, and to try to understand them as the Swiss experience them. Because from an outsider, foreign outsider, many of the fears of the Swiss of Überfremdung are, let's put it mildly, hard to understand, but I will do my best. While fundamental differences remain in the national imaginations of the two countries, and the Swiss are still clear, they are not a nation of immigrants, and the U.S. still asserts that more often than not. The past 2 years in both of these countries have brought change. They've introduced new categories, and in a way, the two countries have actually moved somewhat closer together in their imaginations of themselves. So first of all, let's be clear about one thing. The rising number of migrants worldwide do not reflect any kind of return to an international acceptance or toleration of the kind of freedom of movement that we saw in the 19th century. Migrants today have to carry just as many, in fact, many more, huge piles of paper in order to move. When we think of mobility becoming easier, who we are thinking of are tourists and businessmen who travel for very short periods of work or pleasure. They are temporary. If you want to move permanently, ask any person of any nationality going to any country in the world, and what you will hear are tales of how difficult it is. And if you want, in the discussion, I'm perfectly happy to share my own modest history of emigrating in the 80s to Germany and obviously more recently to Canada. Migration today is still not for the faint-hearted, and all nation states continue to desire whatever they imagine to be desirable migrants while hoping to exclude undesirable ones. Certainly that's the case for both the United States and Switzerland. Both countries today, actually both of them now, and this is a change for Switzerland, privilege family unifiers, people who are coming into the country to join a close family member, usually a parent or a spouse. Both of them also increasingly privilege high-skilled professional workers. And both of them really don't want those unskilled saisonniers or the construction and agricultural workers that were the backbone of the migrations of the 19th century. In both countries, read the debates in this country or in Switzerland, you will see that short-term work permits are now increasingly seen as preferable even for many highly skilled workers, especially in the tech industry. Refugees who have been screened by the UN are preferred to asylum seekers who are trying to find asylum on their own. And especially hated in both countries are, of course, the people who May and I talked about when she was here, I believe, in September, those who are seeking to work who don't have permission to do so, or in the case of the US, to enter the country. These are, of course, the so-called illegal immigrants of the United States and the clandestine, or sans-papiers, of Switzerland. These examples are a powerful reminder that categories to distinguish between desirable and unwanted types of mobile people have again begun to change, because none of these words almost existed in the late 19th century. Maybe we can expect revised imaginations of the nation to follow in both cases. That's a plausible guess. For the first time in US history, current debates focus not just on the border and its fortification and on entry. We now in the United States, for almost the first time, see Americans arguing for the dismantlement of birthright citizenship. And that's a first. That's a real change. Some Americans would even create categories of residency or new kinds of visa that prohibit the naturalization of any person who's entered the US illegally and without proper documentation. It's very hard for someone like me who has spent time in Switzerland to listen to that part of the immigration debate today without wondering whether the United States will soon become more like Switzerland and, in fact, more like the United Arab Emirates. Happily, however, when you look at the survey data, Americans still feel that such radical changes would undercut the nation as a nation of immigrants and thus irrevocably change its national character. For me, it was really fascinating and compelling to watch the debates among Swiss last spring as they debated the results of this referendum that's referred to here, Masseneinwanderung stoppen. In February, the Swiss passed a referendum that said they were going to cut the number of immigrants allowed into the country. They were going to create Raten, which we would translate actually as quotas, much like the quotas that the US created in the 20s and 30s. Past the recent decision of the electorate to ban the building of minarets, which had just happened before, political debate in Switzerland moves very rapidly. It's a relatively small country, and all of this is done not in Congress, not in the legislature, through referendum. So you cannot walk down a street without seeing posters like this everywhere. Given the centrality of the freedom of movement within the European Union, the Swiss referendum proved really controversial, and that's what people were fighting about while I was there. If you look at this next slide, you will see an image of a man with an axe chopping down chopping down what are called bilateralen. Switzerland is not a member of the EU, but over the past 30 years, it has signed dozens, if not hundreds, of bilateral treaties that give it a relationship to the European Union, much like any member nation. And when the EU heard about the success of the anti-immigration referendum in Switzerland, it said, you're going to lose your bilateral treaties because the freedom to move within Europe is an absolutely fundamental concept of the European Union. How much are you willing to give up in order to start patrolling your borders and cutting access to work and residency permits? Now, for an American listening to these debates, the truly astonishing thing is that the Swiss who want to stop massive immigration are quite clear that what they want are fewer Germans, fewer Italians, and fewer Austrians in their country. They say that Europeans don't learn the Swiss dialect. They say that Europeans from Germany, Austria, and Italy don't appreciate the importance of maintaining a kind of historical balance between the French, the German, and the Italian sections of the country, and between the Catholic and Protestant of the country. It took the Swiss literally decades to create that sense of balance that allowed them to form a confederation in 1848. Worse, however, and this is the main criticism that emerges of immigration in Switzerland, is that these new European immigrants do not understand or appreciate what direct democracy means and what it requires. The Swiss are so proud of voting as individuals on up to 25 or 30 referendum a year. And they say, rightly or wrongly, I'm just reporting to you, they say it takes generations, not decades, for a German or an Austrian or an Italian to learn how to function within such a subtle but also very direct electoral system. But even as they debate, look at the words up here, even as they debate restrictions on movement, I see a striking shift in language, and this is my last point. Whether in the polemics published by the Swiss right or the Swiss left, the Swiss are now debating the future of their country through discussions of Einwanderung or immigration, or Zuwanderung and Zugezogene. In other words, they are now using for foreigners categories that 100 years ago were only applied to Swiss nationals. That may not be grounds for Switzerland becoming a nation of immigrants, but one does now see the word Einwanderung applied to a foreigner. And it may presage who knows what kinds of changes comparable to those that occurred, for example, in Germany in 1999 when the nation decided to change its naturalization laws so that people born on its own soil could become citizens in an expedited and quicker fashion. Ultimately, of course, I am an historian. I do not predict the future. I hope in concluding, however, that I have at the very least convinced you of the value of comparison and of looking outside the United States, even if what you seek to understand is your own nation and your own country. Thank you very much. What happens next?
We have further questions. Folks can come up. So I noticed in the chart that there's a spike in 1963 for the popularization of the phrase, and I was wondering what role did JFK play in the popularization of the phrase "a nation of immigrants," or was his book capitalizing on
Well, did May and I also talk about this? This is one of the pieces of history that May and I both kind of march over. Okay, I mean, it is related to John F. Kennedy's book, which was actually published in 1959. So it's after his death and after the introduction by his successor, Lyndon Baines Johnson, of a immigration reform bill that the phrase takes off as part of Kennedy's legacy and as also a reimagining of a better United States that no longer discriminates on the basis of law. Now, the United States did not abandon its desire to restrict in 1965. It created new categories for restricting, and I tried to point to those groups that it privileged: family reunifiers, highly skilled workers, refugees, and those that it rejected: low-skill workers, asylum seekers, and what was the third one? No, low-skill workers and asylum seekers. That's good enough. The United States still restricts, but it did allow increasing numbers to enter, in part because the demand for family reunification skyrocketed over the course of the next 40 years. Sociologists talk about what's called an immigration multiplier. You get one immigrant and you can be pretty sure that 4 to 5 will follow in one way or another. And that is in part what happened. If you want to understand why there are so many people without documents in the United States today, you have to understand the U.S.'s rejection of visas for blue-collar workers. I've been told by immigration lawyers that there are 5,000 visas a year or perhaps 10,000 visas a year, but I can assure you, as having looked at the Labor Department numbers, that the United States generates many, 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 many more than 5,000 to 10,000 blue-collar jobs every year. And there is no line for a low-skilled worker from Mexico to stand in. And that's the downside of the 1965 law and why I continue to refer to the United States as pursuing a policy of restriction. It has not gone back to its support for the freedom to move across its national boundaries that we saw in the 19th century. That's long past, and we're not returning anytime soon. Questions? Want to move to Switzerland? Hi.
So my question is in regards to the conflict between growing nationalist movements in non-Swiss nations versus non-Swiss European nations, and the surge of immigration or migration from conflict zones in that area, like the Middle East and Africa. So how do you see those two forces interacting with one another in like the coming years?
Well, as I said, the Switzerland, like the United States, prefers an orderly relocation of refugees, which means it prefers to relocate small or larger numbers of refugees who have moved into UN camps, who have essentially had, the UN stamp the number on their hand and then find the appropriate place for them to resettle. And in recent years, both because of the conflicts in the Middle East, in Eastern Europe, and in Africa in particular, not just Switzerland, but many European nations near or next to the Mediterranean are experiencing an influx of asylum seekers. And I spent a lot of time reading about asylum seekers while I was in Switzerland. That word, by the way, didn't exist before World War II. It just didn't exist it wasn't a category for thinking about migrants in the 19th century. The Swiss, on average, I would say, want to believe that asylum seekers are just labor migrants trying to sneak in under another name. But they have also experienced real difficulties in removing asylum seekers once their claim to asylum has been judged and denied. They somehow just don't really have the heart to put that person on a boat back to Africa. And that's not just true of Switzerland. That's a pattern that you see across the Schengen countries. Schengen and the European Union created freedom of movement within Fortress Europe, as it's sometimes called, but it made entering Fortress Europe all the more difficult. And the vast majority of articles that I read about asylum seekers essentially claimed they just want jobs, they want our higher standard of living, and so they come in making false claims. Otherwise, why don't they just go through the refugee system that the UN has? And we know why they don't, but that's kind of the way it works. Is that a good answer for you? Does that help?
I think so.
Okay.
I also had another question about like the treatment of migrant laborers in like the UAE versus the United States.
Mm-hmm. He's interested in the treatment of migrant workers or contract workers in the United States and in the UAE.
Because it would seem that in the UAE, it's more recognized, like migrant laborers are more recognized versus migrant laborers here. Like, for instance, like illegal immigrants working in agriculture in the United States, they get treated, or at least in my mind, a lot worse than, or I don't know.
Well, I'll tell you something. This is something that labor movements around the world are really debating in a bit of a quandary about. On the one hand, it's logical. Wouldn't you rather have contract labor out in the open with the requirements and the wages and the working conditions specified as part of a 2-year contract than have, as in the US frequently, workers without documents, not getting paid, dying on the job, things of that nature. On the other hand, the experience with the American labor movement was so negative with the last guest worker program in the US, the Bracero program, which continued for, how many years, from 1943 to 1964, something like that. So good 30-year period. And the labor movement usually argued that hyper-exploitation was characteristic of those contract labor programs, at least under the Bracero program. And if you look at political coalitions around, bills that try to reintroduce temporary labor contracts for all kinds of workers in the United States today, you will often find employers on one side and labor on the other. And that's not true of all issues. I mean, both labor and capital, if you want to use those shorthands, have argued for the admission of larger numbers of immigrants into the United States. So last night I gave a different talk in a different city, and someone said to me, okay, I kind of get it, but we can't just let everybody in. So how do you make choices in how you let people in? And I guess the way I thought about that was that personally, I've decided that regulation but freedom of movement is the best approach. You have health inspections, you ask about how much money, where you're going, you register, but you let people make the choices. Because as an historian, I know that in the past, nobody carried papers, nobody got inspected, and all of Italy never moved to the United States. It has never happened that a poor country has just picked up and moved en masse to the U.S., and it wouldn't happen now. That much prediction I'm willing to make. But if I were queen, the one change that I would make is to create a labor certification program that acknowledged that the United States needs unskilled and blue-collar workers, and stop pretending that it doesn't. Not 10,000, not 5,000, 30,000, 40,000. See what has happened in every state in the United States that has tried to consistently prohibit the hiring of people without documents. Americans do not move to rural Arkansas to slaughter chickens and pigs. Maybe if we starve them a bit more, maybe if we cut social services a bit more, maybe they will. But that's not what's happened so far during a very long and very serious recession for a large population of underemployed industrial male native born workers in the U.S. So I want to see more visas for blue-collar workers. That's a more realistic goal. Yes? Yeah. Well, I see that largely in the 1960s and 1970s. And actually, if you read the writings, it's largely pro-immigrant people who use the phrase, who are usually arguing for a more generous and larger number of admissions that use it. And that's the way in which I think of it as celebratory. It is, however, a celebration, especially in the 60s and 70s, that should give us pause. Because, as I said, there are very significant and important groups of Americans who don't identify with it and who don't think of themselves as the children, grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren, and descendants of immigrants. I don't see the folks who want to do away with birthright citizenship arguing or even using the phrase nation of immigrants. I see it used largely by the more sympathetic and pro-immigrant people. Increasingly, however, you're right, it's not so much a celebration as it is what would happen to us if we abandoned immigration? You know, where would we be? What would our character be as a nation? And in that sense, it's not perhaps celebratory, but it's trying to make you fearful of those kinds of changes. Make us fearful of, for example, abandoning birthright citizenship or reducing the number of immigrants from about 750,000 a year today to much less than that. I don't know, that's not the best question. Most of my sources, frankly, are newspapers. But I've used an incredible range of newspapers. There's so many digitized newspapers out there now. You can look at women's newspapers and African American newspapers. I can look at Native American newspapers in Minnesota and see how they use the phrase, right? So it's a combination of what Carlo Moretti calls, is it Carlo? Calls distant reading, right? I count things. I do kind of like content analysis, and that's what the undergraduates help me with, and then drilling down in to do a more contextualized reading to see what words are associated with Nation of Immigrants, what words are associated with foreigner or alien. I didn't mention the concept of the illegal alien because I know that May had talked about that when she was here, but that's a relatively, the popularity of that phrase is also extremely new. It was used occasionally in the 19th century for the Chinese, but now alien means something quite different. An illegal alien definitely means something quite different than what alien meant when a census taker wrote, "Are you a citizen? Oh, okay, then you're an alien." Right? The meaning has changed as in the last 3 or 4 decades. Oh, hi.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So the European Union immigration law prevents asylum seekers being able to simply buy a ticket and hop on a train. The Dublin regulation stipulates that migrants have to stay in the country where they first claimed asylum.
Right.
As a result, Italy is filling up with migrants who came on a boat and don't typically want to stay there. So the country is notoriously bad at integrating immigrants into society. So how could this debate in Switzerland be a benefactor for this situation?
How could Switzerland be what? I'm sorry.
Be a benefactor for this situation. That
Oh,
Italy's
well,
in?
this is really interesting. So yes, you're absolutely right. The EU requires that asylum seekers seek asylum in the first place where their foot touches ground. And that means Italy, it means Greece, it means Lampedusa, it means the countries that border the Mediterranean, but it also means Ukraine, and increasingly it also means Turkey. The EU wants to see asylum seekers integrated into those countries. And it criticizes especially Italy and Ukraine for failing to become multicultural societies. I had a graduate student who did his work, his research, his field work in Ukraine among asylum seekers. There's no work for them to do. This is a country with an enormously high unemployment rate, even before its recent round of troubles with Russia. And from the perspective of Italy, Ukraine, Greece, and increasingly, I think, Turkey, the EU is using their countries as a buffer zone. And in this really disingenuous fashion, accusing them of not being as multicultural as us Germans. And it's relatively easy to get from Italy into Switzerland because of the mountains. It's impossible to surveil all the mountain passes between Italy and Switzerland. Switzerland is determined, it's not in the EU, but it is equally determined to take as few asylum seekers as possible. Switzerland is quite like the US in some ways. It likes limited government, it likes direct democracy, and it doesn't like to invest actually in infrastructure and social services. And it worries about the costs of asylum seekers, especially because many of the social service workers who work with those asylum seekers really don't want to send them back, even if their asylum claims have been denied. Switzerland is an incredibly wealthy society. It makes the United States look, well, not quite poor. We're not in the same ballpark. As an American, I always say, why are they begrudging help to asylum seekers? Switzerland is rich. Italy is not nearly as rich. What's the problem here? I still don't completely have it all puzzled out, but I've been told repeatedly, we are a small, mountainous nation, Donna. We can easily be overwhelmed by people from outside. And that is the way in which asylum seekers are viewed, as potentially dangerous people from outside who are going to cost money. I don't know if that answers your question, but I hope it does.
No, but thank you.
Thank you. I would like for you to join me in thanking Professor Gabaccia for a wonderful talk and to ask you to join us for reception.